Welcome one, welcome all to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Hello and welcome everyone to the first episode of the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. It is lovely to have you here. I hope you'll stick around for a bit. So this episode, really, more than anything, is just introducing me and also the rest of the podcast, what I'll be talking about, all of that. So I am Jake Black, that is my pen name. I am a writist, artist, composer, and budding game designer. This podcast is, for the most part, going to be focused pretty much exclusively on writing, just because that's what I want to talk about. There might be some episodes relating to art, but probably not, at least not for a while. Composing and game design are something I'm not probably going to talk about much at all, besides today, unless I have something coming out, but we'll see. We'll never know what the plan truly is, because why would we have a plan? And contrary to somewhat popular belief, I'm actually not Australian. I'm not really sure where that comes from, to be quite honest. Apparently some people can hear it in my accent, but I can't. Well, one of the 3 accents I have going at any one time, as I'm sure you can already hear. I'm actually from the UK. So in terms of just groundwork here, I'm not here to give writing advice. That's not the point of this podcast at all. If you find bits and pieces helpful or inspiring, or you think, hey, maybe I'll include that in my process, that's great, but that's not what this is about. I'm just here talking about my process and my craft and doing what I love. First and foremost, really, that's all it is. I just want space to yak on at you for an hour or so at a time. That's really all it is. So yeah, just as I mentioned there, this podcast is mostly just about me, my craft, and my process. But one thing I am also going to do is do interviews with other writers. So let's bring you down here for a minute. If you have a book coming out or are already published, please do get in touch. I am at jblack21 on Twitter. That's where I am for an embarrassing amount of the day, if I'm truly honest. But my DMs, as I'm sure everybody else has this problem too, don't always work for whatever reason. So if I don't reply to your message within a week or so, bounce me an email at jade42black@gmail.com for those who are only listening. And, we'll see what we can do. I'm not going to guarantee a slot for anybody, because I imagine I could get inundated at any point, so there's always that. Also, maybe your book might not be quite the right fit for this podcast for whatever reason. I'm just going to put that out there now. That is completely my discretion. I may or may not provide reasons for that, depending on what they are. That may have something to do with the book, or something to do with you when or if you contact me. Obviously, rude, abusive, and or entitled behaviour will not be tolerated under any circumstances. So bear that in mind. The other thing to bear in mind is if you are indie or self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from the most. That doesn't mean if you're trad pub that I won't talk to you, but bear in mind that you are not my primary acquisition audience. If that was phrasing that I use. I don't know if it's correct phrasing or not for this kind of thing, but it's the phrasing I use, so we're going to stick with it. Okay, so I'm going to say so a lot. It's a bad habit of mine, and I can't be bothered to edit all of that. My main writing project at the moment is The Determined Ones in its various forms. So let me tell you a little bit about it for those that don't already know from Twitter, who's probably like 90% of people who are going to be watching or listening to this, but for those that don't know entirely what it is, who have missed the memo somehow, it is a set of 8 interconnected standalones that I call a compendium. And the reason I call it a compendium and not just standalones or a series is because it kind of straddles the line between both. where each book can be read completely independently as its own complete story, but, excuse me, all 8 of them together form one complete story in the same way a series would do, but in a non-linear timeline. So you could argue that you could call it a collection, a la a short stories collection, but in long form. But I'm more pretentious than that, so we call it compendium. Basically, that's the deal. Which tells you probably everything you need to know about me, really, but oh well. So, the Determined Ones is all adult literature, and it's all thriller and thriller subgenres. That's me, that's what I write. I don't write YA, I don't write kid lit or MG or anything like that. I do write outside of thriller and thriller subgenres. That is something I'm going to get at later in the podcast in future episodes, but that's not what we're doing right now. So, how I got into writing, I feel like that's somewhat of a clean segue. I first started off in flash shorts and microfiction. That's where I still feel very comfortable a lot of the time. I started out in a writing group in person, yeah, back when those were a thing, quite a long time ago now, thinking about it. Probably nudging 6 years ago now, though. Gosh, that feels weird to say. But yeah, we did back then mostly flash and shorts for local competitions, a couple of nationals. I did actually win a couple of those back in the day. But as I said, that was a long time ago. And that was before I really knew what I wanted to do with writing or anything. Back then I wrote, I'm genuinely not quite sure what you'd call it. A lot of it was quite trippy. I guess you could argue it's just like speculative literary fiction, often with quite sort of paranormal type twists to it. And that is something I do want to go back to. But over time, my pieces just ended up getting a bit darker and a bit darker and a bit darker, and that's where I felt comfortable. I feel comfortable writing darker literature, whether that be thriller or horror or anything like that. That's generally where I sit. Getting into long form was just kind of a thing I felt I should do, more than necessarily wanted to do, for quite a long time. And then this idea of writing, bear with me, writing a story about a serial killer, but from the killer's point of view, came into my mind, because I'd not read anything like that. And I thought, hey, that's interesting. And I originally wrote it as a short, and it got out of hand, and oh boy, that is actually a really big theme for me now I think about it. Writing shorts that get out of hand, and then they turn into 8-book compendiums and all sorts more than that. Maybe that's a story for another time, I don't know. We'll see how much time I have left at the end. If I have time for it, I'll tell it now. But yeah, so that's eventually how I got into long form with my first ever project, and then I just had lots of ideas that felt more long form. Once I had sort of proved to myself that I could do it, I felt brave enough to actually take them on. Really, that's kind of all there is to it. I still do a lot of shorts on the side. There was a period where I stopped doing that, but it was pretty brief, to be honest. I do spend most of my time writing long form now, though I have very recently, really, been getting back into shorts for a few things I don't know genuinely. I don't know if I'm at liberty to talk about those, and also just for subcourse, because I've seen a couple that I thought looked interesting. And I decided I didn't have enough to do already, so I started this podcast. So the other how I got into is obviously how I got into drawing. You can see that on the screen if you are watching, instead of just listening, but if you're not, hey, that's all good. Drawing is one of those things I always did when I was a kid, like little yay high kid. it's something, again, I got out of the habit of doing very quickly because I wasn't happy with what I was drawing. I didn't feel I was very good at it. And eventually I just stopped doing it completely. That happened pretty quickly, honestly. And then I ended up getting into digital art, and this is kind of a weird story because a long time ago now, again, like even longer ago, I used to live code music with a piece of very niche software called Sonic Pi. You probably haven't heard of it. And I used to make electronica with that, and when it came to thinking about releasing some of that music, which is all still on Spotify, or this is all under an alter ego for what it's worth, I needed cover art. And I had no money to commission someone, and I had no idea what I wanted and all sorts. So I thought, well, if I do it myself, the only person I can be angry at if it's not right is me. So I'll just do it myself. And all of that early stuff was very sort of abstract vibes. I'm going to be honest, a lot of it wasn't that good either, particularly with my first ever release. Over time, I did get the hang of doing stuff like that, but I never really liked that I was. I know this sounds really derogatory to say, but just doing abstract. Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, I really like abstract art and other people's abstract. It just didn't. I guess it didn't feel very me. Looking back, I always wanted to be able to draw people and do character art, so over a process of years, many years now, I learned to do that, and that is most of the time what I do, although I do also draw bits of environment art and concept art and scenes, and I have a lot of fun doing that too. And so we go into a quick, brief aside here. I am currently open for art commissions. Prices start from 9 Great British Pounds, which is probably about 11 US dollars. Don't quote me on that. I don't know what the exchange rate is at the moment, and it's yo-yoing like hell. By the time this episode goes up, it'll probably be something completely different. As mentioned, I do specialise in character art. I do sketches, which are the cheapest, ink, sort of. If you've ever seen samurai ink paintings, it's sort of inspired by that, but not really quite that style. And also comic art. Again, that's not your typical comic necessarily, it's a bit more realistic than that. But I can also do scenes, environments, and all kinds of other stuff. I've done mandalas of my characters before as well, so that's something that I think is really a cool project. A few terms and conditions here. Obviously, no use for AI training if you work with AI, and this goes for if you want to get an interview as well. If you use AI at any stage of your process, the answer is no, I'm not going anywhere near you. Simple as. I don't take commissions for anything NFT related because NFTs are gross. I don't really care what your view on that is. I don't do comms that are overly sexual or anything like that either. Violent content I'm willing to discuss because I'm more comfortable with that. If it's really overly gory, chances are I'm probably going to have to say no, just for anatomy reasons as much as anything else. I'm not a master of anatomy and I'm not going to pretend to be. You're better off looking at somebody else for that. But if it's just somebody covered in blood, sure, why not? I can do that. I've done that on my own characters in writing and in art way too much. So, a few things. I did sort of touch on this a little bit. Let's go with drawing first because, actually, I forgot to mention my traditional drawings, didn't I? One episode in, I'm already losing the plot. Traditional drawing isn't something I do much of. That's something I've gotten into again in the past probably a year, 9 months or so. I do some stuff with pencil, but mostly it is ink pens, not calligraphy pens, just coloured pens, and just doing little objects and things. There'll be like the odd flower or a fish or something. Recently I did one of a sushi roll and another one of a taco, because that's what I felt like. And that was quite good fun. It's not something I do very often. That is very much a sort of more fun thing that I do. What it's worth for art commissions as well is that my full commission sheets are pinned on my Twitter as part of my positivity thread, so if you're interested, feel free to check that out. So while we're still on the drawing tack, let's go into what I like drawing. So the vast majority of what I draw is related to my writing. It's portraits of characters from my books, my main characters, and little scenes that are in the books sometimes as well. I've done a couple of comic strips of things like that. I've also done environments and concept art relating to that, so a good example of that, I did a big concept art sheet of the National Library of UK, and I also did concept art of one of my characters, Daneth, and his sniper bow. And also just whatever random shenanigans take my fancy, whether that's, hey, here's a picture of a blue rose, you want to draw that? Sure. That's a really, really old one. I'm not sure I ever posted that. But yeah, I've done bits of fan art here and there as well of other people's writings, so Alyssa Larsang's The Keeper's trilogy, I've done a bit of fan art of that, and a long time ago I did one for Nick Ripley's Project Suncloud, but I really should update that because I've improved so much as an artist since then. But that is the vast majority of what I do. Sometimes I'll see an image on Pinterest and think, I want to do something like that. That's pretty common, whether that turns into something from books or not. What I like writing, lengthwise, again, I've sort of mentioned this. When I say long form, I'm, I guess, old-fashioned in saying 75k length books, 80k max. I don't really go beyond that. I think it's very hard to for thrillers. Maybe this is the conversation for another time, maybe it's a future episode, I don't know. But I don't like writing anything beyond that because I don't like reading much beyond that, to be quite honest. For short form, I do flash and shorts, generally between 500 and 1,000 words. Sometimes I'll nudge closer to 1,500, that's more of a recent development. Although lately I have been doing a ton of microfiction. That is a future episode, so keep your ears peeled for that, if that's phrasing, if that's something you're interested in. Genre-wise, I've mentioned plenty of times already. Thrillers are my jam, that's what I do. Although I do have a soft spot for noir and tragedies as well. You know, all the happy stuff, that's me, I write happy things. Such happy things. Themes. Now this is kind of an interesting one for me. It's not something I've thought about until quite recently, and I've noticed patterns about that. So a lot of the time I'm writing about family and family issues. That is something that comes up a lot. Treason is another thing that comes up a lot, and human rights. Law is another one, and politics. I'm very interested in law and politics, though that's not something I tend to get into publicly for probably obvious reasons at this point. And also mental health is kind of a big one, which is not deliberate. I mean, none of this is really deliberate besides the family and politics stuff. When it comes to mental health, I feel like that's just par for the course when you're writing really dark literature, is your characters are gonna struggle with the amount of stuff that gets thrown at them. So, it just ends up being in there, and that's just how it is. And then we get on to, this is probably genuinely all I'm going to talk about with composing, besides mentioning that the intro and outro music is one of mine, for what it's worth. What I like composing is something that, I mean, I have a lot of things I like composing, as you can see if you're watching the video. I like composing fusion. That's my big thing, is getting instruments from all around the world, whether that be anything ancestral to me in sitars, or just things I like kotos and all sorts, and mushing it all together into one composition that is usually just very vibe focused. I really like composing to a vibe, that's what I feel I'm good at. So that's what I do most of the time. That can look very different. A lot of the time it's very big and quite ethereal, I guess is the word I'm looking for. But lots of big textures and big reverb and all of those goodly things. Again, phrasing. I have no control over my brain sometimes. Jazz is the other big one. I love jazz. I really do. That's kind of a recent thing, but I am a huge jazz fan. It's so much fun to compose, so I do a lot of that. Metal is the other one. I've been a lifelong metalhead, raised on metal, completely. Well, not completely, but mostly. And it's good fun to compose in metal, whether that be digitally or with instruments, because, fun fact, I play 10 instruments. I did have that on a fun fact on one point in this freeform document, but I guess that went at some point. But yeah, I do. And orchestral and sort of, when I say traditional, I basically mean orchestral instruments in a smaller scales. That could just be, for example, viola, double bass, and flute in the composition. So it's orchestral instruments but not a full orchestra. Or that could also mean more traditional Persian style music, for example. Stuff like that is really fun, just because I like big sounds. That's, I think, kind of a theme with everything. All of these genres are quite big. Although then we get onto flamenco, which again is a much more recent thing. Well, I guess not really, if I think about what time actually is, although it's just a construct anyway, and I like to pretend it doesn't exist, but you know. Yeah, flamenco's good fun, because one of the main things I do with composing is just pick really, really weird time signatures and sort of compose to that. So a lot of the time lately that's ended up being 15/16. Yes, I'm really that person. If you're not a musician, it probably means nothing to you, but if you are, it does. A lot of the time I mess with changing time signatures and keys and a lot of really odd syncopation. Things like metal, jazz, and flamenco all work really well with that. With fusion, the gloves are off, there are no rules. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I am with writing, and not so much with drawing. Actually, I have a very specific process with drawing, and very specific things I like doing. But that's kind of my deal. Gloves are off, no rules, let's have some fun. One thing I should also mention with the determined ones going forwards, because I already forgot to mention this and I will forget to mention it again, are my characters' names. There are 8 books, 8 different POVs, 8 different main characters. So we have Ai Nagashima, who is a war hero and veteran, and he has since become a politician, well, diplomat technically, but it's an interesting career change, let's put it that way. Then we have Haru Nakagami, who is a professional diplomat. That is his job. He specializes in human rights. We have Hanzo Oyama, who is a complete fucking hellion, genuinely. He is actually a politician, not a diplomat. There's a lot of crossover between him and Haru, which I think is cool. And then we have Koni Minagashi, who I don't talk about that much, who is also a diplomat, but in a slightly different sense, in the sense that he does a lot of travelling, whereas the other 3 don't in the same way. We've got Shinichi Miyamoto, who is the POV character of one of the two projects I'm drafting at the moment. He is an elite soldier and specialises in assassin work. So he's quite different there. Then we have Helga Olviadottir, who is the other MC of my other drafting project. And she is... Damn, I should have thought about this first. She is on the sort of leading council of her nation, and she doesn't really necessarily have that much of a specialism. That's actually something she's kind of struggling with at the moment. That's not a spoiler, by the way, for what it's worth. She is the only female determined one, also, for what it's worth. Then our last two, we have Curtis and Mia, who is by far the youngest of the determined ones. Most of them are around 30 to 50, I guess is sort of average. Curtis is, at this point, sort of 13 to 15. He is a prince, and he is in a tight spot. There's not much I can say about that without spoilers, genuinely. And then last but certainly not least, we have Isamu Fujimoto, who is a jazz guitarist. So the other thing about the determined ones, as you have probably gathered from a few things I've said already, is it's not a contemporary setting. It's set in an alternate world that... Actually, the world itself doesn't have a name, but the continent does, although that has not appeared on page, so I'm not going to say what that is. And it's something I've only very recently discovered, but the main places are Hyukai and Malastale. Those are the two big ones. I'm still not sure if I'm saying Malastale correctly, because I don't know what French pronunciation is. I tell you what, I'm going to type that on the screen, right here. If you know how to pronounce things in French, by all means, try and tell me how to pronounce this, because I don't know what it is. We also have Sør-Fjordvik, which is where Helga lives, that borders Hyukai. We have Heraith, which is a place I don't talk about very much because it's not very significant generally. We've got Liera, we have Saleh, Abarici, Quianjong, again, not quite sure if I'm saying that right, Kana, and... Man, I've been so efficient I've named them. No, I forgot Busan. I always forget Busan, but that's just communist Switzerland in the middle. Quite literally, it's kind of communist Switzerland. That's kind of the... I mean, that's the closest comparison I have. So, last but not least, in terms of introducing me, because I actually don't feel I've done very much of that, talking about my hobbies, because apparently I do things for fun very occasionally when I'm not working like a slave, I guess. I play a lot of video games, that's a big thing for me, being a game designer, but also I've been a lifelong gamer as well. My favourite franchise is by far The Legend of Zelda. I think that's pretty clear. I'm sure I've mentioned it a few times on Twitter, every now and then. Other things I like are puzzle games, the Professor Layton series, particularly the older ones I'm a big fan of, and indie games as well. I've been getting into a lot more indie games lately. Unfortunately, I am the insufferable person who solves puzzles for fun. Every now and then I have a few of the Times puzzle books, so I've got Code Word, I've got a lot of number and logic puzzles, and one that's called Killer Sudoku as well. So, make of that what you will. And other things that I don't know if I've ever talked about publicly before, I do embroidery for fun. Every now and then. It's often quite, for want of a better word, delicate embroidery, where I'll take a little scene or a small object, again like flower, and just effectively do coloured line art of it, or sometimes it'll be mostly black line art with a pop colour, which is quite similar to a lot of my digital art, I guess, in terms of having a lot of black and or grayscale with a pop colour. Another thing I do for fun is, this is a recent thing, is building miniatures. So, a while ago I did actually post about this. I built a book nook for my bookshelf, which is a recent purchase. And that is if you don't know what a book nook is it's a book-shaped object where instead of having a spine, that's sort of a window into a little scene. Mine is of an East Asian street. It was labelled in some places as China, others as Japan, so it's not really a particularly clear influence. I've also done a model house as well. I mean, all this is proving is I have no chill, if that's what I do to relax, to be quite honest. I also paint every now and again. That's something I'm trying to get back into. A lot of my paintings are abstract, because that's what I like doing with paint a lot of the time. Though, again, I'm trying to get more into samurai-style paintings as well, just because I think those are really beautiful. And then also, I did mention a little bit earlier, pen-pencil drawings as well. I have a lot of fun doing those when I do them. But that's pretty rare. I've sort of done these in the list in order of how often I do them. So, last but not least, going back to in case you want to be interviewed, because I did touch on this briefly, but I do want to mention it again here now, in case anybody listening has forgotten, or now that you've heard more of a full episode you think, yeah, okay, let's take a punt on this. When you contact me about this, if and when, tell me, please, what the title of your book is, what the genre is, and just a little bit about your book in general, whether that be some sort of blurb or synopsis type thing. It doesn't have to be finalised bullet points, so chill, that's cool. If you're doing self-pub, I'm aware you probably don't have a query-ready level synopsis or blurb until it's very close to completion, because why would you, frankly? So yeah, if you are interested in that, by all means, get in touch. I'd be more than happy to hear from you. Future episodes will be a lot about what I like writing, genre-wise. But in any case, that concludes the first episode of this podcast. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like and or subscribing to the channel if you don't want to miss out on future content. Copyright J Black 2023.